There are moments in hockey that never make the highlight reels, yet they tell you more about a player than any goal or assist ever could. This is one of those moments. Nick Robertson has finally opened up about what happened immediately after he was traded to the Pittsburgh Penguins, and the detail that has everyone talking isn't about a contract, a lineup, or even his new opportunity. It's about a single text message. Robertson revealed that the very first Penguin to reach out to him was none other than Sidney Crosby. His words were simple. When he got traded to Pittsburgh, Crosby was the first guy to text him right away. On the surface, it sounds like a small gesture, but the more you dig into it, the more you realize why this has become one of the most talked about off-season stories around the NHL. Here's what I'm hearing. Around the league, this moment is being viewed as another example of why Sidney Crosby continues to earn respect from teammates, opponents, coaches, and executives alike. Nobody is claiming that one text message changes the direction of a franchise, but people around the league believe it says a lot about the culture Crosby has helped build in Pittsburgh over nearly 2 decades as captain. And when you consider everything Nick Robertson has gone through to reach this point in his career, it's not difficult to understand why that message meant so much. Robertson arrives in Pittsburgh looking for something every young player wants but doesn't always receive: a genuine fresh start. His time with the Toronto Maple Leafs was filled with flashes of offensive talent, but it was also interrupted by injuries, lineup competition, and limited opportunities to establish himself as an everyday NHL player. Every season seemed to begin with hope, only for another obstacle to appear. Whether it was injuries, roster depth, or simply struggling to find consistent minutes, Robertson never quite managed to secure the role many believed he was capable of earning. My take on this is that Robertson's situation in Toronto became one of those stories where expectations kept growing while opportunities became harder to find. The talent was obvious. His release, his skating, and his scoring instincts were never really questioned. The bigger question was whether there would ever be enough room for him to develop without constantly looking over his shoulder. Sometimes a player simply needs a different environment. That's why this move to Pittsburgh has generated so much discussion. From what I've been told, the Penguins didn't acquire Robertson just to add another depth forward. The organization sees upside. They see a player who is still young enough to develop and skilled enough to contribute if given the right opportunity. General manager Kyle Dubas knows Robertson well from their years together in Toronto, so this isn't a gamble based on limited information. It's a calculated decision by someone who has already watched Robertson's development up close. That familiarity matters because it means Pittsburgh likely has a clear vision for where Robertson fits moving forward. But before Robertson could even step onto the ice in a Penguins sweater, something happened that immediately changed his first impression of the organization. According to Robertson, Sidney Crosby reached out almost immediately after the trade became official. Think about that for a second. We're talking about one of the greatest players in NHL history, a 3-time Stanley Cup champion, a 2-time Olympic gold medalist, a Conn Smythe Trophy winner, someone whose resume speaks for itself. Yet instead of remaining distant from a newly acquired teammate, Crosby personally welcomed him. That's the detail fans can't stop talking about. Here's how I read this situation. Crosby didn't have to send that message. Nobody would have criticized him if he waited until training camp. Nobody expected him to personally contact every new player who joins the organization. But that's exactly why Robertson's comments have resonated with so many people. Leadership isn't always delivered through speeches in the locker room or interviews in front of cameras. Sometimes it's shown through small actions that never become public, unless the person receiving them decides to share the story. And that's exactly what happened here. Robertson didn't tell this story because someone forced him to. He brought it up because the gesture genuinely stood out. When asked about arriving in Pittsburgh, he explained that Crosby was the first player to welcome him. That first interaction immediately made him feel comfortable joining his new team. Considering everything Robertson had experienced during his years in Toronto, that first impression carried real significance. League sources have long described Crosby as someone who leads quietly. He isn't known for dramatic speeches or public confrontations. Instead, he earns respect through preparation, professionalism, and consistency. Over the years, countless teammates have spoken about the standard Crosby sets every single day, whether it's practice habits, conditioning, or simply treating everyone inside the organization with respect. Robertson's story fits naturally into that larger picture, rather than feeling like an isolated incident. One thing I find especially interesting is the timing. Robertson is entering perhaps the most important chapter of his NHL career. He's no longer viewed solely as a prospect with unlimited time to develop. Now the expectations change. Pittsburgh believes he can contribute, but eventually potential has to turn into production. That's the challenge ahead. Yet if you're looking for the ideal environment to prove yourself, learning alongside Sidney Crosby isn't a bad place to start. People around the league believe this fresh start could be exactly what Robertson needed. The Penguins are transitioning into a period where adding younger players has become increasingly important. Crosby remains the face of the franchise, but management also understands that injecting new talent into the lineup is essential. Robertson fits that vision because he still has room to grow while bringing offensive ability that could flourish with greater confidence and stability. I'm also hearing that fans have reacted positively because this story reinforces something they've believed about Crosby for years. His leadership isn't manufactured for cameras. It's not something that only appears during playoff runs or award ceremonies. Instead, it's reflected in everyday actions that rarely receive headlines. Ironically, it took Robertson sharing one personal experience for the rest of the hockey world to see another example of that leadership in action. And that brings us to another fascinating part of this story. Robertson admitted that growing up, Crosby was one of the players he admired. Imagine being traded to a new team, wondering what your future might look like, and then seeing a message from someone you've watched your entire life. That's not something most players experience. For Robertson, it wasn't simply a welcome text from a teammate. It was a message from one of hockey's biggest icons, letting him know he belonged in Pittsburgh before he had even unpacked his bags. Now, does one message guarantee that Nick Robertson is suddenly going to become a 30-goal scorer? Of course not. Hockey doesn't work that way. Talent still has to translate onto the ice, opportunities still have to be earned, and every player still has to prove himself once training camp begins. But here's what I'm hearing from people who follow this league closely. Confidence can change everything for a young player, and sometimes confidence starts with something as simple as knowing your new captain genuinely wants you there. That's why this story has generated so much discussion, despite the fact that it isn't about a blockbuster trade or a record-breaking contract. It's about the first impression Robertson received when he officially became a member of the Pittsburgh Penguins. Instead of feeling like another player fighting for a roster spot, he immediately felt welcomed by the most important voice in the dressing room. My take on this is that Crosby understands something many great leaders eventually learn. New players don't just arrive with talent, they also arrive with uncertainty. Robertson isn't coming to Pittsburgh after dominating the NHL for years. He's arriving after several seasons filled with injuries, inconsistent opportunities, and constant questions about whether he'll ever reach the level scouts once believed he could. A veteran captain recognizing that reality and reaching out before anyone else says a lot about how Crosby approaches leadership. If you followed Crosby's career, this shouldn't come as a surprise. Throughout his time in Pittsburgh, former teammates have consistently described him as someone who leads through preparation and respect rather than public attention. He's rarely interested in making headlines for his leadership. Instead, those stories usually come from the people around him. Robertson's comments simply add another chapter to that reputation. From what I've been told, Pittsburgh's front office also believes Robertson still has considerable offensive upside. They didn't bring him in just because he was available. They see a player whose development may have stalled more because of circumstance than because of ability. Robertson has always possessed an impressive shot and a natural scoring touch. The challenge has been staying healthy and finding a consistent role where he can play with confidence. That's one reason this move feels different. Robertson isn't walking into an unfamiliar organization without connections. General manager Kyle Dubas already knows him from their time together in Toronto. There is already an understanding of the type of player Robertson can become if everything comes together. That existing relationship may remove some of the uncertainty that often comes with changing teams. Here's how I read this situation. Pittsburgh isn't asking Robertson to become the next Sidney Crosby. They're asking him to become the best version of Nick Robertson. Those are two completely different expectations. When young players try to justify every headline or every contract immediately, they often put unnecessary pressure on themselves. But if Robertson focuses on playing his game, using his speed, creating scoring chances, and staying healthy, this could genuinely become the fresh start many have been waiting to see. Another interesting aspect of this story is how fans from both Toronto and Pittsburgh have reacted. Many Maple Leaf supporters have expressed happiness for Robertson, despite being disappointed that things never fully worked out. They remember the excitement surrounding him when he entered the organization and understand how injuries repeatedly interrupted his progress. On the other side, Penguins fans see a young forward who still has untapped potential and could become an important piece of the team's future if everything clicks. League observers have also pointed out that this type of culture matters during a long NHL season. Every organization talks about leadership, but not every organization demonstrates it in small moments. When a franchise captain personally welcomes a new teammate before training camp even begins, it sends a message that extends beyond one individual. It tells every player entering that room they're joining a team built on accountability, professionalism, and respect.